Romantic. The rain had been falling all afternoon in Lahore, painting the streets in shades of silver and gold as the city lights reflected on the wet pavement. The air was heavy with the scent of petrichor and the distant aroma of chai brewing somewhere in a street stall. Ayan hurried along the narrow lane, his jacket pulled close, trying to shield himself from the drizzle that had now turned into a determined downpour. He wasn't supposed to be there that evening. His original plan was to meet a friend across town, but traffic had trapped him for nearly an hour, and the rain had only made the roads worse. By the time he finally got free, he needed a place to wait out the weather. That's when he spotted it. A small, warm-looking book cafe tucked into the corner of the street, its windows glowing like a promise of comfort. The little bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the smell, a mix of freshly brewed coffee, paper, and rain-soaked air. The cafe was quiet, save for the gentle hum of background jazz and the occasional clink of cups. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with books in every size and color, their spines like old friends waiting to be rediscovered. Ayan shook off his jacket, scanning for an empty seat. And that's when he saw her. She was sitting alone at a small table by the window, her fingers curled delicately around a mug of coffee that was still steaming. Her book lay open in front of her, though it seemed like she was reading slowly, savoring each page. Strands of dark hair had escaped her loose bun, falling gently across her face. The lamplight above her table cast a warm glow over her features, highlighting the curve of her cheek and the soft focus in her eyes. She wasn't the kind of beauty that demanded attention. Hers was quieter, the kind you might miss if you weren't looking carefully enough. But once you noticed, you couldn't look away. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Their eyes met. It couldn't have been more than 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds, something shifted. The cafe seemed to fade, the sound of the rain softened, the chatter at the counter dissolved, even the music felt like it had been turned down. All that remained was her, sitting there, holding his gaze with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. Her eyes were deep, not in the way people often romanticized, but in the way that made you feel like they carried entire stories, maybe even entire lifetimes. There was a faint curiosity in them, as if she too was quietly trying to understand him in that moment. Then just as suddenly, she looked back down at her book, the connection severed like a thread gently snipped. Ayan realized he had been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, feeling something stir in his chest, not the fleeting interest of seeing someone attractive, but something quieter, heavier, and far more dangerous. It was the beginning of a pull he knew he wouldn't be able to ignore. He found a seat across the room, though his eyes betrayed him more than once, glancing back toward her. She didn't look up again, but I noticed the way her lips curved ever so slightly, like she was smiling at something in her book. Or maybe at the thought of him. He couldn't be sure. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass, and the world went on with its usual chaos. But for Ayan, everything had already changed. That one glance had planted something, a question, a longing, a promise he didn't yet understand. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she was there, didn't know if he'd ever see her again. All he knew was that he wanted to. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start a love story.
Romantic. Some people say chance encounters are just coincidences, but Ayan was starting to suspect fate had its own way of arranging things. A week had passed since that rainy evening, a week where her face had refused to leave his mind. The memory of her sitting by the window, the soft fall of her hair, and the 2-second connection they'd shared had replayed in his head more times than he'd like to admit. He had convinced himself she was probably just a stranger he'd never see again. And then, on another cloudy afternoon in Lahore, he stepped into the same cafe, partly for the coffee, partly for the books, but mostly because he couldn't help hoping. The bell above the door chimed, and his heart stumbled when his eyes landed on her. Same table, same warm lamplight, only this time she wasn't reading. She was sipping coffee slowly, gazing out the window as though watching the world pass in soft focus. Aeon felt a nervous energy rush through him. He wasn't going to just sit across the room and watch, not again. He walked to the counter, ordered his usual, and as the barista handed him his cup, he glanced around the cafe. Nearly every seat was taken, except the one across from her. It was the perfect excuse, or maybe fate's subtle nudge. He took a steadying breath and approached her table. "Hi," he said, his voice lighter than he felt. "The cafe's a bit full today. Mind if I join you?" She looked at him, recognition flickering in her eyes, as if she remembered him too. Her hesitation was brief, more like surprise than doubt. Then she nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Sure," she replied. He set his cup down and slid into the chair across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The air felt fragile, like a glass ornament that could shatter if handled carelessly. "I think I saw you here last week," Ion ventured. "I remember," she said, her voice calm but not cold. It was raining. That tiny confirmation eased something in him. They both remembered. The conversation began cautiously, the kind where you're both testing the water, unsure how deep you can go without sinking. They talked about the cafe, about the unpredictable weather, about how Lahore seemed to live in two worlds, one of constant movement and one of stillness in places like this. Then slowly, like the sun breaking through clouds, their words began to carry warmth. She laughed softly at something he said about coffee being more addictive than his phone. He smiled when she told him she sometimes came here just to people watch, making up stories about strangers in her head. In between sips of coffee, he learned her name, Zara. He learned she loved old songs, the kind with lyrics you could feel, not just hear, that she had a favorite corner in every bookstore she visited, that her favorite author was one he had read but never fully appreciated until she described why his words mattered to her. And somewhere in the middle of their conversation, Aeon realized he was leaning forward without meaning to, drawn closer not by her beauty alone, but by the way her mind seemed to light up when she spoke. And then she said something that stayed with him long after that afternoon. She said, "I've never been in a love story, but I like to believe in them. Maybe that's why I read so much, to borrow other people's happy endings." Aeon wanted to tell her that some love stories didn't need to be borrowed, that some could be written in real life, starting in small cafes with hesitant conversations. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, they talked until the shadows in the cafe stretched long and the crowd thinned. Eventually, Zara gathered her things, and they both stood. "It was nice talking to you," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "You too," he replied, though he wanted to say more. As she walked toward the door, Aeon stayed seated, watching her step out into the soft drizzle. She didn't look back, but he didn't need her to. Because he knew the story had begun. It started innocently enough. A text here, a casual message there, just follow-ups from conversations they had at the cafe. But what began as simple check-ins slowly turned into something neither of them had planned. Ian found himself glancing at his phone more often than usual, waiting for the small vibration that meant her name had appeared on his screen. At first, it was just about books, a quote she wanted to share, a recommendation he thought she might like. Then it moved to music, exchanging playlists late at night, challenging each other to find songs the other hadn't heard before. The conversations flowed easily, like a river finding its path without force. Sometimes they talked about their day, the little annoyances, the small victories, Other times they went deeper, peeling back layers they didn't usually show to people they had only known for a few weeks. For Ian, the nights felt different now. He'd lie in bed, phone in hand, a smile tugging at his lips as they discussed everything from childhood memories to absurd what-if questions. Zara had a way of turning even the simplest topics into something beautiful. She didn't just answer, she made him feel like his words mattered, like she wanted to know not just what he thought, but why. For Zara, it was both surprising and unsettling, the way she felt so at ease with him. She wasn't someone who opened up easily, but with Ian, it didn't feel like work. He didn't push, didn't pry, yet she found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. There were moments when she'd be in the middle of a message and stop to wonder, why am I telling him this? But the answer always came in the form of a quiet truth. She trusted him. One night, the clock had just passed midnight when their conversation turned unexpectedly personal. "If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?" Ian asked. Zara's reply came after a short pause. "Somewhere quiet. Maybe a little house by the sea. I'd want a library in it, big enough to get lost in. You?" He said, "I think I'd pick somewhere with mountains, someplace I could wake up and see them every morning. Feels like it'd keep me grounded." "I like that," she typed back. "Maybe one day we could trade views, sea for mountains." The message was followed by a smiley face, but Ian read between the lines. He wondered if she realized she had just imagined a one day that included both of them. The late-night talks became their quiet ritual. Ian would wait until the rest of the world seemed to fall asleep before starting a conversation, knowing she'd be there. Zara, in turn, began saving little thoughts during the day just so she could share them with him at night. Sometimes their chats were long, stretching into the early hours until one of them would finally admit defeat. "You should sleep," she'd type. "Not tired," he'd reply, even though his eyes were heavy. Other times the messages were short. A single sentence, a single thought. But they lingered just as much. What they didn't say spoke just as loudly as what they did. Neither of them dared to name what was happening, but they both felt it. The quiet shift from friendship to something warmer, deeper, and far more dangerous. One evening, after hours of talking about books and music, Zara sent a message that made Ian pause. "You ever think about how some people just find their way into your life and change it without warning?" His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he replied, "Yeah, I think I'm living that right now." She didn't answer immediately, but when she did, it was simple. "Me too." Ian read that message more times than he'd like to admit, and Zara, though she wouldn't say it out loud, found herself smiling at her phone for no reason at all. Neither of them called it love, not yet, but it was no longer just chance, no longer just conversation. It was the start of something real. The evening had been unplanned, like so many of their best moments. Ayan had suggested dinner after a lazy afternoon in the cafe, and Zara had agreed without hesitation. They'd found a small restaurant tucked away in one of Lahore's quieter streets, the kind of place where the light was warm, the music soft, and the world outside felt far away. Over plates of kebabs and steaming naan, they talked about everything and nothing. The conversation was effortless, weaving between teasing jokes and comfortable silences. Ayan noticed the way Zara laughed, not loudly, but in a way that made her eyes crinkle just slightly, like she was letting herself be completely unguarded. By the time they left, the city had settled into night. The rain from earlier in the day had left the streets damp, and the air was cool. Street lamps lined the road, casting pools of golden light onto the pavement. They walked slowly, their footsteps in sync without trying. Zara was in the middle of telling a story about her childhood, something about a kite festival gone wrong, her laughter spilling into the quiet night. Ayan was watching her more than listening, though he wouldn't admit it. The way her hair caught the light, the way her voice carried warmth, it all blurred into something more than just admiration. And then, mid-laugh, she stopped walking. Ayan slowed, turning toward her. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, really looked at him, as if she was seeing him for the first time and recognizing something she had been searching for without knowing it. The air between them shifted. It wasn't a dramatic pause, not the kind filled with racing heartbeats and sweeping music like in the movies. It was quieter, deeper, the kind of stillness that feels full, like the world has narrowed to just two people in the space between them. Ayan felt it too, that subtle but certain pull that told him this wasn't just friendship anymore. It wasn't just comfort or chemistry. It was something stronger, something that had been growing in the background of every conversation, every shared smile, every message sent late at night. He didn't think, he simply reached out, his hand brushing against hers. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then slowly, her fingers curled around his, holding on like it was the most natural thing in the world. No words, no explanations, just a quiet agreement that something had changed. They began walking again, hand in hand. Neither of them spoke about it, but their silence was full of unspoken promises, of the knowledge that they had crossed into new territory. The city around them continued as usual, a car passing in the distance, a shopkeeper closing up for the night, the faint hum of a rickshaw somewhere far away. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the warmth of her hand in his, the steady rhythm of her steps beside him, the way she seemed to lean ever so slightly closer. Ayan glanced at her, catching the faintest smile on her lips. She wasn't looking at him now, just ahead, but he could see it, that quiet, content curve that spoke more than words could. In that moment, he realized he didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. This, the two of them walking under street lamps, sharing the same pocket of air and light, was enough. It was real, and it was theirs. And Zara, though she didn't say it, knew it too. Her heart felt steady, not racing, the kind of steady that comes from finding the right place to belong. When they finally reached her street, they didn't rush their goodbye. She squeezed his hand once before letting go, her eyes meeting his for just a second longer than necessary. "Good night, Ayan," she said softly.
Every love story, no matter how gentle its beginning, eventually meets its first test. For Ayan and Zara, it came without warning, wrapped in an envelope of opportunity. It was a Tuesday evening when Zara told him. They were sitting in their usual corner at the cafe, sharing a slice of cake. She had been quiet all evening, stirring her coffee more than drinking it. Finally, she looked up, her eyes holding a mix of excitement and hesitation. "I got a job offer," she said, "in London." Ayan blinked. "London?" She nodded, a small, almost disbelieving smile on her face. It's my dream job, Ayan. A publishing house I've admired for years. They want me to start next month." The words hung between them, heavy and bright at the same time. Ayan felt the initial wave of pride for her. She had worked so hard, and she deserved every bit of success. But beneath that pride, a cold ache began to form. "Wow," he managed, forcing a smile. That's amazing, Zara." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "I know it's sudden, and I don't want you to think—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "I don't want this to change anything between us." He nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. "It won't. We'll be fine." They both wanted to believe that. In the days that followed, they tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. They still met at the cafe, still went for walks, still stayed up late talking, but beneath every conversation was the shadow of what was coming. When Zara spoke about her new role, her eyes would light up, and Ayan would listen, smiling, even as a part of him silently counted down the days until she would be gone.
He didn't want to dampen her joy. This was her moment, and he wouldn't be the one to take it from her. But inside, he was breaking. At night, lying awake, he thought about the empty seat across from him at the cafe, the quiet phone without her messages in real time, the absence of her laughter beside him. He told himself they could make it work. People did long-distance relationships all the time. But love, he knew, wasn't just about messages and calls. It was about presence, about those small, ordinary moments that didn't translate across time zones. Zara, too, felt the weight of it. She didn't say it out loud, but the closer her departure came, the more she lingered in their time together, sitting a little longer after their walks, holding his hand a little tighter. Sometimes she'd watch him when he wasn't looking, memorizing the way he furrowed his brow when concentrating, or the way his smile started in his eyes before reaching his lips. One evening, they stood outside her house after a long walk. The street was quiet, washed in the soft glow of a street lamp. She looked at him and said, almost in a whisper, "I wish you could come with me." He smiled faintly. "Me too." But they both knew it wasn't possible. His work, his life, everything was here, and hers soon would be there. They didn't talk about it much after that. They tried to focus on the days they still had, rather than the ones they would spend apart. But the unspoken truth remained between them, like the air before a storm, still, tense, waiting. The night before she was set to leave, Ayan walked home alone, the streets empty around him. The weight in his chest felt heavier than anything he had known. He wanted to tell her not to go, to ask her to stay, but the words caught in his throat. Because love, he believed, wasn't about holding someone back, even if letting them go was the hardest thing he'd ever do.
Romantic. The night before she was set to leave, Lahore felt unusually quiet, as if the city itself understood what was about to happen. The streets were hushed under the soft glow of street lamps, and the air was cool from the drizzle earlier in the evening. Ayan had messaged Zara earlier that day. "Meet me at the cafe tonight? One last time before you go." She had replied with a simple heart. When he walked into the cafe, she was already there, at their table by the window, the one where it had all begun. Her coffee sat untouched, steam curling lazily into the air. She smiled when she saw him, but he noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. He sat down across from her, the same way he had the first time they spoke, though tonight felt heavier, fuller. No laughter filled the air, no easy teasing. Just the weight of a goodbye neither of them wanted to say. They didn't talk much at first. They didn't need to. Their hands found each other across the table, fingers intertwining naturally, as if they were afraid that letting go too soon would make the moment vanish. "I don't know when I'll see you again," Ayan said finally, his voice quiet but steady. His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles. "But I promise you, no matter where you go, my heart will be yours." Zara's lips trembled into a smile that didn't quite hide the glisten in her eyes. "And mine will always find its way back to you." They sat like that for a long time, memorizing each other's faces, the exact shade of their eyes in the warm cafe light, the way their smiles curved, the way their breath seemed to sink without trying. Ayan wanted to tell her everything that had been pressing against his chest for weeks, that she had become the part of his day he looked forward to most, that her voice was the soft place his heart rested, that he couldn't imagine the cafe, the city, or his life without her in it. But he knew if he started, he might not stop, and tonight wasn't about pleading. Tonight was about love without conditions. So, instead, they shared small pieces of themselves, the way they always had. She told him she had found an old book for him, one they'd talked about but he had never read, and slid it across the table. Inside the front cover, she had written in neat handwriting, "For the days when we're apart, so you can still hear my voice in the words you read." He smiled, holding the book like it was made of glass. In return,
He pulled out a small envelope from his jacket and handed it to her. He said, "Don't open it now. Open it on the day you miss me the most." She slipped it into her bag without asking questions, because trust had always been easy between them. As the evening stretched on, they talked about the little things they would do to keep each other close, sending pictures of sunsets, recommending songs, reading the same book so they could discuss it across time zones. It was a plan built on hope, stitched together with the belief that love could survive distance if the hearts carrying it were strong enough. Eventually, they had to leave. Standing outside the cafe, the city quiet around them, they held on to each other like they were holding on to the night itself. "Goodbye," Zara whispered, though the word felt wrong, too final. "Not goodbye," Ayan said, pressing his forehead to hers. "Just see you soon." Her tears dampened his shirt as they held on for a few seconds longer. And then, with the hardest kind of courage, they let go. As Zara walked away, her figure fading into the night, Ayan stayed rooted in place, his hand still warm from where hers had been. The promise they had made didn't need to be spoken again. It was already stitched into their hearts.
The months apart were both a test and a lesson. They survived on video calls that stretched late into the night, the glow of their screens a poor substitute for the warmth of each other's presence. Letters crossed oceans, carrying words that seemed to weigh more than paper should. Sometimes, the envelopes arrived creased and worn from their journey, but the ink inside remained clear, proof that their connection, though stretched thin by distance, refused to break. There were surprise visits, too. Ayan would never forget the time Zara appeared at the cafe's doorway on a rainy afternoon, unannounced, her coat still damp, her smile brighter than any light in the room. Those moments were rare, fleeting, but they carried enough joy to keep the harder days bearable. It wasn't easy. There were missed calls, time zone mix-ups, and days when the ache of wanting to be together settled like a weight in their chests. But love, the quiet, steady kind they had built, held firm. And then came the winter evening that changed everything. Ayan had gone to the cafe out of habit, more than hope. The city was wrapped in cold, a fine mist hanging in the air, and the windows of the little shop glowed with a familiar warmth. He settled into their usual table, the one by the window where it had all begun, his coffee steaming between his hands. He was halfway through a book when the door opened, letting in a gust of cold air. He looked up and froze. Zara was there. No video call lag, no pixelated smile, just her walking toward him with the same grace, the same sparkle in her eyes that had first caught him off guard all those months ago. She looked different in small ways, a heavier coat, a new scarf, but at the same time, she was exactly as he remembered. "I'm home," she whispered when she reached him. For a moment, Ayan could only look at her, his chest tight with the sudden, overwhelming realization that she was here, not for a visit, not for a week, but for good. He stood, pulling her into his arms without hesitation. She fit against him as if no time had passed at all. Around them, the cafe went on as usual, the clink of cups, the hum of quiet conversation. But a few patrons paused to watch. There was something in the way they held each other, something unguarded and true that seemed to reach beyond them. When they finally pulled back, Ayan searched her face. "For good?" he asked, as if needing to hear it twice to believe it. She nodded. "For good. I realized that while the job was everything I dreamed of, it wasn't home. You are." He smiled, his eyes warm and a little wet. "You know, love isn't about grand gestures," he said softly. "It's about showing up, over and over, even when it's hard." Zara reached for his hand under the table, squeezing gently. "And holding on through the storms so you can stand together in the sunshine." They sat for hours that evening, talking about everything and nothing, slipping back into the rhythm they'd always had. There were no fireworks, no dramatic music, just the quiet contentment of two people who had weathered the distance and found their way back to each other. When they left the cafe, the winter air was sharp against their cheeks, but neither noticed. They walked hand in hand through the city streets, past glowing shop windows and the soft hush of falling night. It wasn't the beginning of their love story anymore, and it wasn't the end. It was the part that mattered most. The part where they learned that love wasn't a single moment, but 1,000 small ones stitched together. The glances, the laughter, the late-night talks, the promises whispered over coffee. And in that moment, as Zara leaned her head against his shoulder, their story, quiet, steady, and unshakable, melted every heart that happened to see them.